Hello. Since this is going to be the last video lecture that I'm recording, I just want to take this opportunity to cover a couple of applications or interesting ideas that we haven't had the chance to go over in the sound unit. So kind of wrapping it up, not anything overly complicated, hopefully, but just expanding on some of what we talked about already with a cool new example. Although before I get to the example, I do want to talk about the Doppler effect, which is probably something that you are at least partially familiar with, as far as knowing that the Doppler effect maybe is the reason why when you listen to a police siren or fire truck going by, this noise that it's making or the pitch of the noise gets different depending on how it's moving in relation to you. So I'd like to just talk through that because that's kind of an important concept in physics. And then I have, like I said, something else to show you. So I'll jump into the PowerPoint because I always think it's helpful to have something to look at for reference as I'm explaining this. But I think a really good way of picturing the sound waves in the Doppler effect with a more physical example would be a person in a wave pool. So imagine you're standing in a wave pool, and if the source is constant, you're going to have waves hitting you at a regular intervals. So the frequency of the whatever's causing the waves isn't changing. The waves are going to crash against you at a very constant rate. However, if you all of a sudden start swimming towards the wave source, it's going to seem like you're getting having waves crashing you more often. And that's because when you take your relative velocities, if you're moving towards it as it's moving towards you, if you take your position as being like stationary, in comparison, the wave's going to seem like it's coming a lot faster. So those waves are going to come a lot closer together. And that's the exact same way that it works with sound waves. So when you have a sound source, and this picture they use the little dots to show where the source is at any given time, just changing color based on the time that it is. So when that source emits a sound, the frequency of the sound is only going to depend on the medium. So the motion of the source has no effect on the sound wave itself as once it's been emitted. And so it's going to spread out in all directions at a constant speed, not going to change. So you can kind of see then in this picture that when it's leaving the red point at time equals 0, the sound is going out in a circle, just kind of like ripples are. So if the sound wouldn't move, you'd see a ripple pattern growing. However, if we say that our source is moving to the right at a constant speed, when the sound is emitted for the second time, it's going to start the ripple from a place that's slightly to the right. And then again, the t equals 2, again, moving towards the right. So the ripple pattern you see ends up being pushed off towards the right in a sort of bunch. So Nancy, who's standing towards the side that the source is moving towards, to her, the waves seem to be smushed together. Whereas for Pablo, who's on the side with the source moving away from him, they seem to be a lot stretched out. So to those two viewers, the wavelength appears to be different. And so the frequency that they're detecting, or the frequency for them, is going to be different because of that wavelength. So for Nancy, she's going to hear with a smaller wavelength a much higher frequency or a higher pitch noise. Whereas for Pablo, it's going to sound like like the sound is lower in pitch, despite the fact that the source is identical for both of them. So it just all has to do with their location and what the wavelength looks like relative to where they are standing and where the source was emitted. And again, the wavelength is the distance between crests, and that's only changing because the source is not stationary. So where it's stationary, it would be identical for both of them, but when it starts moving, that wavelength is going to change relative to the speed and the direction that it's moving in. So it's going to seem a smaller wavelength for Nancy, a much larger wavelength for Pablo. And there actually is an equation to calculate the frequency for the person on each side. That's not something that we're going to do any calculations with, but it's important to know that there is a concrete way of calculating this because it allows us to use the Doppler effect for something more than just saying, oh, the sound changes as that airplane flown by. There are some pretty important real life applications, one of which has to do with measuring like blood flow. So if blood is moving through the body relative to things around it, we can take into account like the pumping of your heart. So it has like a source that's pumping it out at regular intervals, but then motion relative to something, you can understand more about how blood is flowing inside your body, which can obviously be kind of important for someone who's going to the doctor and maybe they're doing operations or something. So won't get too much into the technicalities of that, but that is one given application. Another one that's pretty important for scientists is using it to better understand the universe, specifically what is happening to our universe in terms of whether it's growing or shrinking. Because sound is a type of wave, but so is light. And light is constantly being sent across the space from our sun, from distant stars. And so we can measure or keep track of light from stars that are thousands of light years away. And depending on how that light, the frequency of the light is changing, we can know whether the star is moving towards us and away from us. So this can be as simple as something like in a galaxy that's rotating. So yes, it's going to be getting closer and farther away. But in the grand scheme of things, for something that's even in a different galaxy, you could know whether or not the universe itself is expanding. So scientists use the Doppler effect with light to argue that our universe is in fact expanding. So that's a pretty cool application. Definitely a little more useful than just knowing why vehicles that drive by make different sounds, but that is also nice to be able to understand why different observations of things you see in the world around you happen the way they do. So that's the Doppler effect. But like I said, there was one other, something that I think is really cool, because who doesn't like fire? And that's a Rubens tube. And I think it does a great job of kind of summing up a lot of what we've talked about, both with oscillations like on a string through to sound. So the best way I can show this is through a video. So let me pull this up. Of course not. So this is the second one I want to show. I guess I can go ahead and show it first. So it works a lot better if you have just a single frequency. This one is kind of fun because it's sound, it's actual songs instead. But the way this works, as you can see, we have a long tube. Be made out of a lot of different things, just like a pipe. And then there are little holes in the top. And what you do is you pump some sort of flammable, like gasoline or something, into it. And then you can use a speaker or an amplifier or something to have sound waves traveling through the pipe. And as we know, in any type of tube, as well as in just normal air, sound waves will form a standing wave. And those standing waves will have nodes and antinodes. Where there's antinodes, there's going to be a fluctuation between compression and rarefaction. Where there's a node, there's going to be no movement. So as far as the air in the tube goes, if there's a place with a node with like that, where the pressure is going to be different, the fire there is going to be either much smaller or non-existent, whereas in an antinode, you're going to get a much bigger flame because of the air pushing the gasoline like to those points. So it's a little, like I said, a little harder to see in the video with music. It's more impressive with music, but as Mr. Bray has talked about, and I mentioned in some other videos, when you have music, there's not going to be a single frequency, but some overtones. So you won't have as clear of a pattern as if you just had a single frequency playing it at one time. But I'll play this kind of just let you look at it because I think it's fun to watch. A couple different songs here. I like this. And as you can see, that's a much more noticeable change in the level of fire. but it doesn't necessarily have the, it's not as easy to tell where the waves themselves were, like as in the last song where you could sometimes see, oh, now here it gets a bit better, but you can like distinctly see just for a moment where the nodes and antinodes are. So that's with music. Well, let me just play with this a bit. Unfortunately, it doesn't like me going from one YouTube video to another. So let's see if I can do this without messing up anything too significantly. All right. Sorry about this. So let's try this again now. Sure. All right, so this one is a setup where they just play a single frequency. I'll play it for a second, but it is kind of an annoying noise, so I will turn it off then and just let you see how it's a lot more noticeable now, kind of like when we had the string set up in the front of the room where the sounding waves, you could see the nodes and antinodes, except now it's with fire instead. So just like a very cool visualization about how the same things we talked about for mechanical waves that traveled through water and the ground also work just the same when they're traveling through air, because you can't really see sound waves, so this is neat. Yeah. So instead of music, we have high-pitched noises, but
so I can't have this up here.
All right, we'll mute them. But then as it gets higher, we're going to have more and more nodes and antinodes form across the wave. So then when you don't have like the perfect frequency for it to send up, you see that the waves temporarily disappear, kind of like they did when we didn't have the right frequency in the string. But then when you hit that frequency, you see the nodes and antinodes start to pop up again. And then not quite as easily visible the more that you get. Let me skip a little bit. Here's a more clear one. There we go. So it's really neat. Apparently Mr. Bray actually normally does this setup. I'm still not entirely sure how you do that in the classroom with, fire and all. It seems like kind of a safety hazard, but it is a really neat example. So I wanted to be sure that even if it's not in person, it's still something you got to see. I think it is a pretty neat summary of, like I said, a lot of what we've talked about with frequency of the tone being set out, wavelength. You can actually literally measure that based on the nodes and antinodes, the way that we have crests and troughs with transverse waves. We have rarefactions and compression points on longitudinal waves. So things that stretch from the whole oscillation to sound waves and even into light, which is something that maybe Mr. Bray will start with you next. But that is all I have for you. It has been such a pleasure to be able to do these things for you online. It's definitely not what I was expecting when I got into student teaching, but you all have made this such a positive experience for me. So I really want to thank you for everything you've done, both in the classroom and online setting, just being really great and making this an awesome semester for me. I hope that I was able to make this at least a little bit interesting, that you learned something. So yeah, thank you. Maybe I'll see some of you for the Zoom meeting on Friday, but take care. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the semester, and I wish you all the best. Bye.